If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles and want to help us keep the show rolling, the best thing you can do, apart from listening, of course, is to share it with a friend or with anyone you know who's just a bit obsessed with history. The odder, the better. Thanks so much for your support, and I really do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. Let's talk about Mary Shelley. Now, Mary is usually introduced as the woman who wrote Frankenstein, what's often called the very first science fiction novel. But for me, she's always been much more than that. You know, she's a symbol. There's something haunting, almost prophetic in her work. And the idea that if we can treat those who are different from us with cruelty, or if we abuse the natural world, sooner or later there will be a reckoning. That's the beating heart of Frankenstein. And if you ask me, it's as urgent today as it was when she first wrote it, over 200 years ago. Now, you might not have read the original novel, but odds are you've seen Frankenstein in some way, shape, or form. There are, believe it or not, 114 film adaptations. And that's not even counting the stage plays, the spin-offs, the cartoons. And I think for me, it all started with those glorious old Hammer horror movies. You know, The Curse of Frankenstein, The Revenge of Frankenstein, The Horror of Frankenstein. You know, monsters with bolts in their necks, mad scientists bellowing, "It's alive! It's alive!" You know, those type of things. I think the moment I heard that, I was absolutely hooked from the very start. So I think to picture that, me as a boy, curled up on the sofa, hiding behind a blanket with my mum and my aunts, peering out between my fingers. Late at night, you know, it must have been at least 9:30 at night, which was late. Absolutely convinced that whatever horrors were happening on screen, nothing could possibly get past a barricade of Scottish women, especially ones under 5 feet tall and utterly indomitable. The monsters, yes, they were frightening, but I think even as a child, there was something tragic, something almost heartbreakingly human about them. You get the sense, even now, that the true horror isn't the creature itself, it's actually what's done to him. And of course, there's been films about Mary Shelley herself. Maybe you've seen the 1986 cult classic Gothic with Natasha Richardson, or the more recent 2017 film Mary Shelley, which is very atmospheric, if a little on the romantic side for me. But the truth? Mary's real life is where the real Gothic story lies. She was a teenager, motherless, wildly intelligent, and just a tad rebellious. Raised by parents who were some of the most radical thinkers of their age. Haunted, almost stalked by death, yet obsessed with the possibilities of life. And then, on a storm-lashed night by a Swiss lake, she dreamed up a tale that would change the course of literature, and perhaps even modern science, forever. So what do we really know about Mary Shelley? Well, as it turns out, there's a lot more to her story than people realize. Mary Shelley was born in 1797 in Somers Town, London, just behind now where Google's glass and chrome fortress stands very proudly. But don't be fooled by the modern postcode. Mary's roots were anything but ordinary. Both of her parents were giants of their age. Her father, William Godwin, was a political philosopher, probably the best of his day, a proper radical with big, unsettling ideas about liberty and justice. And her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, the Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the world's first feminists who literally thundered that women deserved real education, real equality, and of course, the right to shape their own destinies. An incredibly dangerous idea back then, but let's be honest, still a bit dangerous now, depending on who you ask. Educate women? Give them a voice? It was revolutionary. And of course, in many places, it still is. And that's the tragedy that never fades away. Mary Wollstonecraft died just days after bringing Mary into the world, complications that led from the childbirth. And it's a heartbreakingly common way for women to die. But knowing that didn't make it easier for a young girl who grew up believing deep down that her mother's death was her fault just by being born. That's a shadow, I think, that never quite left her. As for William Godwin, well, Mary absolutely adored him, idolized him even. But when she was only 4, he remarried. Her new stepmother wasn't exactly a wicked stepmother, certainly not in the Disney sense, but she certainly wasn't a cuddler either. She doted on her own children, and Mary, already without a mother, found herself pushed gently but firmly to the sidelines. Her childhood was hardly conventional. There may have been dolls and hopscotch somewhere in the background, but mostly Mary grew up in a house crammed with books and bustling with some of the sharpest minds in London. Godwin's home became a sort of unofficial intellectual salon. Scientists, poets, firebrands, philosophers, all dropping in for debates that sometimes lasted until dawn. It was effectively an open house salon. Come at whatever time pleases you and will entertain you. And I think Mary would have absorbed most of it, if not all of it. You know, the poetry recitals, the arguments about justice, the wild talk about the soul and the cosmos. Not exactly what you'd call a normal childhood then, and certainly not a normal childhood now. And she suffered too. She had chronic eczema, which left her ill and incredibly self conscious in an era when illness was still kind of shrouded in suspicion. Mary was considered frail, delicate, something to be protected, and by some pitied. She bore the burden of 2 legacies: a mother that she was expected to live up to but never knew, and a father whose affection was always just out of reach. And I think it would have made for a very difficult childhood. I think she would have been lonely. I think she was intensely intellectual. And I think she was haunted by grief and expectation. Yet, out of that loneliness, something absolutely extraordinary was forged. A mind brave enough to ask the most unsettling, most dangerous questions. Mary grew up feeling very much like an outsider. And honestly, who could blame her? You know, she's motherless. She's caught between a distant father and a stepmother she couldn't quite love. She's regarded as delicate and different, never quite fitting into the neat boxes that 18th century world had actually built for her. So no wonder that she withdrew, first into books, and of course then by osmosis into her imagination. There's a story, beautiful, a bit gothic, and very Mary Shelley. Effectively, that she learned to write her name by tracing the letters carved on her mother's grave. Imagine it, a little girl in a misty English graveyard learning her letters from cold marble, dead flowers pressed underfoot. I mean, you don't get more gothic than that, do you? But let's not imagine her as all darkness and shadows, because she wasn't that. You know, Mary had strawberry blonde hair, and there was a brightness to her, a quiet energy, not quite the black, cloaked, gothic heroine that later legend would paint her to be. And let's be honest, you know, special people are often redheads, I have to say. And not everybody saw Mary as some doomed child of gloom and thunder. You know, visitors to the Godwin house were often charmed by her. her wit, her quick conversation, her curiosity, her way of quietly drawing people in. She wasn't always the sickly shadow in the corner. And I think, like any child, she had days of laughter, and I would also say days of silence. The guest list at the Godwin home was not your average Sunday roast crowd. As I mentioned before, the house was an open salon. You would have had writers, agitators, reformers, people who really did change the world with their ideas, and they would have floated in and out. And it was one of these particular guests, just a little older than Mary, who would upend her life and change it forever. His name? Percy Shelley. Now, Percy was a character, born into money, proper upper crust English, but absolutely allergic to everything that his class stood for. He went to Eton, he then went to Oxford, but he was so determined to scandalize the establishment that he actually got himself kicked out publicly. Picture him standing outside the chapel at Oxford, handing out pamphlets with titles like The Necessity of Atheism. Let's just say that didn't win him any friends among the deans. Shelley was a radical to the core. He was also one of the world's first ever known vegetarians at a time when most people thought eating a potato was a bit continental, let alone skipping meat. And he championed free love, social revolution, and the total, I think, upending of every value that Britain actually cherished. And yes, he was basically a vegan in 1810, which is either mad or spectacularly ahead of his time. But for Mary, this wild, idealistic, in many ways dazzling young man wasn't just an eccentric house guest. He was a complete revelation, a thunderclap, a bolt from the blue. And it wasn't long before Mary, still a teenager, actually ran away with him. He was absolutely brilliant. He was charming, and he was genuinely idealistic. And crucially, he was Mary's father's number one fan. He'd read everything that William Godwin had ever wrote and was utterly besotted by the man's ideas, and he sent him endless adoring letters. Now, William Godwin wasn't just flattered by Percy's attention. He was also spectacularly broke. And the family's finances were a complete disaster. So suddenly there's this wealthy, wide-eyed aristocrat who shows up. He's full of revolutionary zeal, and I think more importantly, with ready cash. And you can imagine the calculations running through Godwin's mind. Maybe, just maybe, this posh lad with a pocket full of ideas is my ticket out of debt. And that's how Mary met Percy. And by all accounts, they fall for each other almost instantly. Mary's 16, Percy's about 20, maybe 21. And yes, let's acknowledge that's already a bit questionable, but not by much. He's basically the mature student who haunts first-year philosophy seminars, isn't he? Quoting Rousseau, droning on about the noble savage and asking if you've read Kant in the original German. And we know these people, don't we? We all know these people. And worse, he's obsessed with your dad. It's not the usual green flag, is it? Respect, I think, is fine, but full adoration for your father's political manifestos, well, that's another matter completely. Still, for Mary, desperate to find her place, to live up to her parents' names, I think it means everything. Percy doesn't just love her, he loves her ideas. He clearly loves her family and her heritage. And he doesn't see her just as the child of radicals, but I think he sees her as a radical in her own right. And that's incredibly important. No surprise, Mary is swept away, completely, gloriously flattered. It's that simple, isn't it? Someone who just gets you, who makes you feel like you actually matter in this world. And we're all looking for that person. It's a bit like someone saying to me, Keith, your mum makes the best cup of tea I've ever tasted. And that's why I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Well, fair enough. I mean, who could argue with that logic? Let's get married. Anyway, back to Mary and Percy. So, what did they do on their first date? It's a rhetorical question because I don't think you'll ever guess it. You're probably picturing a lovely stroll along the Thames or maybe a quiet candlelight dinner, right? Oh no. They went to a graveyard, and not just any graveyard either. The grave of Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary's own mother, the woman who died, bringing her into the world. And according to several sources, it wasn't just poetry and mournful contemplation. It was actually there, on her mother's grave, that Mary lost her virginity. I have to say, nothing, I mean absolutely nothing, is more gothic than that. It's almost too much to believe, isn't it? But the more you dig into Mary Shelley's life, the more that you see that for her, death, love, sex, poetry, guilt even, they're all inextricably tangled together from the start. As much as I know this story, I always go back to this should be the strangest twist in the story, in her story. But with Mary and Percy, we're only just getting started because there's another wrinkle. Percy is already married. Yes, married. Not secretly in some clandestine arrangement, properly, publicly. Everyone knows he's married. But Percy, ever the radical, has a ready explanation. To Percy, marriage is an institution designed to oppress women, to chain them to men, to claim them as property and tradition. He and his band of philosophical friends have declared war on matrimony, on principle. Philosophically, politically, morally, they're all opposed. And I have to say, you might think that's very convenient, because now Percy can effectively cheat on his wife and say with a straight face, well, I'm not betraying you. I'm actually liberating you. I'm cheating on you because I respect you too much to make you my wife. His first wife, Harriet, had also eloped with him for her own good, she said. They ran away, they had a child, and then predictably, Percy got bored, he moved on, he found a new cause, and of course he found a new muse. So technically when Mary met Percy, she was the other woman, 16 years old, and already cast as the mistress in someone else's tragic opera. And just like before, Percy had a plan, run away together, under cover of darkness. No dramatic speeches, just a 5 a.m. escape, bag in hand, not a sound to wake the stepmother, just slip out the door and vanish into the dawn. But it wasn't just Mary and Percy who were doing this. Mary decides to take her stepsister, Claire, along for the ride. I guess because why not? I mean, if you're already running away in the dead of the night with a married poet, why not bring your stepsister too? Let's take the romantic drama and crank it up another notch. Suddenly, it's less an elopement and more like a bizarre road trip. A party of 3 off across the channel, wandering effectively through Europe like the world is your strangest gap year ever. Now, Claire, Mary's stepsister, was very clever and very charming, and by Mary's own account, just a little bit too good at French, which was obviously handy in France, but it also meant that she had that slightly infuriating air of being useful, a bit too much the teacher's pet. And of course, it turned the runaway adventure into sort of sibling rivalry. But you can also see what's happening. Percy, with his wild eyes and his armful of poetry, seemed to think that he was founding a new utopia, one radical teenage girl at a time. So where did they end up landing and staying for a while? Well, Switzerland. Because if you're dreaming up a brave new world, why not start in the land of lakes, mountains, and philosophical neutrality? Switzerland was, to Percy and his crew, almost a blank canvas. The future, if you like, a place to shake off the dust of old England and paint their dreams in broad revolutionary strokes. A society without kings, without churches, without annoying wives or inconvenient rules. A republic of poetry, free love, and radical ideas. Or at least I think that was his plan. The reality? Well, it was much colder, much darker, and far more haunted than any of them could have imagined. But I think for Mary, for Percy, for Claire, Switzerland was, well, I think it turned into a complete disaster. For one thing, they picked up the absolute worst moment in European history to go backpacking across the continent. A little hiccup at the time was the Napoleonic Wars. Not the best time to be British, wandering through the French countryside. The roads were blocked, armies were on the march, and to make matters worse, France was, how can I put this? Full of French people. You can almost hear the whining. So what they then decided to do was to head straight back home. Except there's a snag. No one has any money. Percy's family had finally had enough and cut him off. No more allowance, no more trust fund, no more wild ideas funded by the family fortune. But here's where I think it gets really interesting. As they traveled, Mary was writing. Her very first book, actually, it was a sort of travel journal, the 19th century version of a blog. A very soul-searching book about war, society, and the shape of the world as it was unfolding before them. And I think it's important, though, because you can see Mary starting to find her voice in this first book. She and Percy actually wrote together. They shared notebooks, swapped ideas. Their creative partnership was born in the middle of all this chaos and disappointment. 6 weeks later, when they eventually limped back into England, Mary fully expected her father, William Godwin, the original free love radical, to welcome her home with open arms. Surely the man who preached rebellion would understand his daughter's own small revolution. But he didn't. Godwin actually slammed the door in their faces. And I think it's the adage that it's all fun and radical manifestos until your very own daughter runs off with a married poet. Suddenly, the family values come roaring back, and Mary and Percy are officially outcasts. No home, no money, no friendly faces. And just when you think it can't get any messier, Claire, Mary's stepsister, begins an affair with none other than Lord Byron, the man who managed to be both the most beautiful and the most scandalous person in any room. A sort of a modern version of Johnny Depp kind of meets Mick Jagger, of the Regency era, I suppose. So Byron's living in Switzerland, and Claire, of course, becomes pregnant by him. She persuades Mary and Percy to take her back to Byron, because as everyone knows, the best way to get your ex's attention is to turn up in the same country, pregnant, with your friends in tow. So back they go. They rent a house right next door to Byron's villa. And what unfolds there becomes the stuff of legends to come. The year is 1816, and the year of 1816 was actually titled The Year Without a Summer. The weather is wild, the skies are dark, and there's a reason. Mount Tambora, a volcano in Indonesia, had erupted the previous year, effectively blanketing the globe in ash and plunging Europe into a cold, eerie gloom. Thunder was rumbling over Lake Geneva. Candles were flickering at night, rain beating against the windows almost 24 hours a day. And inside, in that charged Gothic hush, Byron, on one very boring evening, and inside, in that charged Gothic hush, Byron suggests a game. Let's each write a story, and we'll tell that story at the end of the night. And they do. That strange, stormy night, the seeds of 3 legendary tales are actually planted. There's a vampire story by Byron, a ghost story by one of the group, and of course, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, let's just get something straight. Byron's vampire was not the the brooding, tragic anti-hero that you see played by Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt. Forget the billowing shirts and the fluffy sleeves and the mournful stares. In Greek myth, vampires were a lot closer to hairy goblins than to smoldering supermodels. They were ghoulish, not glamorous. But Byron's version, his is different. His is beautiful. His is pale, and the vampire is dangerous. And this was new. And something about the way Byron carried himself made his vampire aristocratic, magnetic, a little bit menacing. And it just seemed to fit with Byron's own personality. Byron's personal physician, John Polidori, took notice. He listened to Byron's story, he tucked it away, and later it was him who turned the idea into his own novel, The Vampire. Polidori, a bit of an outsider himself, actually did something very clever. He based his vampire squarely on Lord Byron. And just like that, the modern vampire was born, seductive, doomed, coldly elegant. The original bad boy. That story went on to inspire Bram Stoker's Dracula. And from there, well, you know the rest. The vampire craze that haunted pop culture ever since. All of it, the birth of modern horror really began with a group of restless romantics stuck indoors by bad weather, passing the time with ghost stories and a little friendly rivalry. And Mary, well, her story was actually something even darker, wasn't it? So if you ever find yourself watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you can actually thank Lord Byron for giving vampires their aristocratic swagger. And it's not just Buffy. Almost every modern vampire, Anne Rice's Lestat, the Immortals of Twilight, the endless parade of gothic anti-heroes, owes something to that wild, stormy summer at Lake Geneva. Because while Polidori wrote The Vampire, it was Byron who actually gave the creature its shape, its style, and its bite. Now, did Byron actually insert himself into the story, or did Polidori do it for him? It's an interesting question because historians have actually argued this point for decades. But I think one thing's for sure. Polidori published The Vampire with Byron's name right on the cover. Not a footnote, not with apologies. Byron front and center, because Byron was the absolute superstar of the day. I think he was possibly the first superstar in history. So the question then comes, was it a calculated move? And I think almost certainly it had to be. Was it also an homage? Maybe. Either way, Byron was absolutely furious. And of course, the friendship soured. And even though the story was a complete smash hit, it became an absolute massive wedge between the two of them. As for Polidori, his life ended in heartbreak. He actually took his own life not long after, another casualty of the reckless darkness that seemed to hover around these romantic figures. And of course, while all this drama and kind of stormy weather was swirling outside, Mary Shelley, just 18 years old, was nurturing an idea of her own. Not something spun out of a group conversation, but something that seized her in the small hours, a walking nightmare so vivid she could barely breathe. And she would later describe it as a vision, almost a possession. A young man kneeling beside a thing that he has stitched together from dead bodies. A creature, vast and hideous, opens its eyes and lives. And that vision, of course, became Frankenstein. So Mary returns to England in 1816. still just 18, and starts to write. She pours out the first draft of her novel in a matter of weeks, which is absolutely remarkable enough on its own. But then you look at the title, and it gets even more impressive. She called it Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. And that's no accident. In Greek myth, Prometheus is the titan who steals fire from the gods, brings it down to humankind, and pays a terrible price for his trouble. Fire, the symbol of knowledge, power, even life itself. And for his rebellion, the gods chain him to a rock where an eagle, sometimes it's a vulture, depending on the translation, rips out his liver day after day for all eternity. The ancient groundhog story. I think Mary also saw Victor Frankenstein as her own modern Prometheus, a man so hungry for knowledge, so desperate to crack the secret of life, that he overreaches. He plays God, doesn't he? And I think for his hubris, he loses everything that matters. And the punishment isn't quick or cinematic. It's slow, psychological, almost existential. And he's left utterly alone. And just pause for a second. Mary was 18. 18. While most of us at that age were actually worrying about, spots or braving your first party or learning the fine arts of instant noodles, Mary Shelley was busy penning one of the most enduring, unsettling novels in literary history. And I think it's easy to forget just how young she was. But I think maybe that's also part of what makes Frankenstein so raw, so electric. There's no neat moral at the end. No, everyone learned a valuable lesson and lived happily ever after. It's very messy, it's painful, and I think that's what makes it utterly alive. Sometimes I think our own generation was raised in the long shadow of tradition, but we managed to break just enough rules to set things up for the ones who then came after. And if you look at teenagers now, they're building startups, they're writing apps, they're publishing novels from their bedrooms. There's a bit of that entrepreneurial Prometheus fire in them. Maybe, just maybe, I think a little bit of Mary Shelley too. And here's the thing. I didn't grow up reading Frankenstein. I wish I had. It's bold, it's strange, and it's full of ideas. But no, we were given the safe classics, the ones that you could show on a TV that rolled on squeaky clean. Films with that statically VHS buzz, always just a little out of focus. That was actually the height of our classroom glamour. But Frankenstein, now that is a truly great novel and one that's been deeply misunderstood. I think largely thanks to Hollywood, to Halloween costumes, and to endless parodies. We all think of Frankenstein as the monster. Big, green, neck bolts, grunting and lumbering about, terrorizing villagers. But in Mary's book, and I urge you to read it, the creature is actually something else entirely. He's intelligent, he's articulate, he's gentle at first, he's curious about the world, and he's desperate to be loved. It's society, the way it recoils in horror, the way it shuts him out, that's what turns him into a monster. At its core, Frankenstein is a story about creation, about abandonment, about the corruption of innocence. And Mary Shelley wrote all of that when she was still a teenager. It took a couple of years before Frankenstein finally appeared in print, and when it did, in 1818, Mary's name was nowhere to be found. Of course not. She was a woman after all, and that meant that the book was published anonymously, with a dedication to her father, William Godwin. And of course, naturally, everybody assumed it must have been written by someone in his circle, maybe even Godwin himself. Who else, they thought, could have produced something so wild, so ambitious, so deeply unsettling? 2 years later, when Mary finally revealed herself as the author, she didn't just have to defend the book. she had to defend her right to have written it at all. And because it came out anonymously, she received no royalties. The novel was, of course, pirated, reprinted, and then passed from hand to hand. Frankenstein spread everywhere, but Mary never saw a penny from its success. And while all this was happening, tragedy kept circling. Percy Shelley's first wife, Harriet, took her own life. A terrible, sad end. That event finally allowed Percy and Mary to marry, but it didn't bring happiness. In fact, things only grew more difficult. On that note, let's just take a quick message, and we'll be back with part 2. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Mary lost 3 children in quick succession to miscarriages and to illness. Her half-sister, Fanny, also died by suicide. And it must have felt as if death was following Mary everywhere she went. The grief was just relentless. She once wrote that she dreamed of putting her baby by the fire, hoping that the warmth might somehow bring the child back to life. And it's an absolutely heartbreaking image, one that echoes through the pages of Frankenstein, where the idea of reanimation is both horror and hope. And here's the thing. Mary's imagination wasn't just fantasy. This was the age of scientific marvels. Scientists like Luigi Galvani were experimenting with electricity, making the legs of dead frogs twitch and jump. The boundary between life and death, between science and magic, felt almost porous, I think, and certainly unstable. The idea of reanimation wasn't completely outlandish. It hovered right at the edge of possibility, and I think Mary absorbed it all. So Frankenstein isn't just a gothic tale or a horror movie. It's a meditation, I think, on what happens when our curiosity races ahead of our responsibility, on the dangers of playing God without the wisdom to know what comes next. It's also, frankly, a bit too close to home these days. Even now, we rush headlong into breakthroughs, AI, genetic engineering, whatever comes next, without always stopping to ask, should we? What will this mean for us in the future? Mary, I think, saw that danger clear as day, the risks of brilliance without restraint. And during all this, these 5 turbulent years, Mary wasn't just surviving, she was working. She actually managed to earn a living as a writer, which was almost unheard of for a woman of her time. But her personal life on the other side of that coin was falling apart. And Percy? Well, Percy was not exactly what you'd call supportive. So Mary and Percy moved to Italy, where a whole new expat community of British writers and poets had actually set up camp. And I can only imagine that it's a bit like the literary version of Ibiza. Sunshine, inspiration, a hint of wild living. Byron was there naturally kind of holding court with his usual air of scandal and charisma. And Percy, well, he fit right in. They settled in Pisa for a while, and Percy gathered a circle, if you like-minded friends, men who loved a good debate, a few too many drinks, a bit of sailing, a bit of shooting, and of course, writing endless verses of poetry. And of course, there was a club for everything. But Percy's crowd, believe it or not, called themselves the Pistol Club. Very subtle, very subtle. Nothing like making your intentions clear, isn't there? Percy was still writing, still producing extraordinary poetry, still burning with ideas. But as Mary, kind of haunted by loss after loss, slipped further into depression, Percy seemed to slip further away from her. He surrounded himself with friends, with philosophy, with flirtations, while Mary was left more often than not on her own with her own grief. And what does history do with all this? It eventually labels Mary as cold, as being distant, and she had this moniker, the Ice Queen. Shelley's friends muttered that she was a disappointment as a wife, that she'd become hard, she'd become difficult, even unfeminine. And you can almost hear them over their wine and cigars. Poor Percy, imagine being married to a woman like her. But how could she not be distant? Her world was saturated with death. She was grieving the unimaginable, trying to hold herself together while everyone around her expected her to be charming and witty and fun. The judgment, as ever, landed squarely on her shoulders. Looking back, it's actually surreal to think about what Mary Shelley was actually enduring. Imagine it. You're living in a foreign country, your children have died, one after the other. Your husband is off gallivanting with a bunch of poets and aristocrats who call themselves the Pistol Club, and you're left behind, quietly trying not to drown in sorrow. Percy, our great anti-establishment hero, insisted he wasn't a privileged aristocrat. All the while, he sailed around the Mediterranean. He wrote dreamy letters to other women and generally behaved like a man who'd never had to worry about a gas bill in his life. Meanwhile, Mary was left to pick up the pieces, and you can almost picture her thinking, well, I suppose I'll just be over here, quietly disintegrating while everyone else writes odes to freedom and the beauty of the Tuscan sky. But you can't help but wonder, did all this, the miscarriages, the heartbreak, the loneliness, push her even deeper into herself, into her art? From childhood, she'd carried this secret guilt, this sense, I suppose, that her very existence had cost her mother's life. And now, here she was, losing child after child, as if history were repeating itself, punishing her all over again. That guilt that runs through her letters, that runs through her writing, it's like a dark current, never quite spoken, but it's always there. And of course, there was no one really to talk to it about. No therapist, no best friend to take her out for a coffee and a cake. Just Mary and her grief and a growing, painful sense of isolation. Yes, one child survived, Percy Florence Shelley, but then her marriage was strained to breaking. Percy was distant, restless, almost searching for something or someone else to inspire him. He even turned his poetic affections towards Jane Williams, the wife of one of his close friends, Edward Williams. Percy, in his classic Shelley style, started writing love poems to Jane, right under Mary's nose. But I then wondered, did he see it as betrayal? I don't think he did. I think he was a romantic. I think everything was inspiration. I think everything that he did was for art. Eventually, Percy and Edward decided they needed a bit of a break from the family, a sailing trip down the Italian coast, and off they went, full of adventure and ambition. Mary would later write that what happened next was the greatest tragedy of her life, because Percy and Edward never came back. Their little boat, so full of plans and poetry, was actually caught in a violent Mediterranean storm, and both men were lost at sea. And what's especially cruel is how hope lingers, when the bodies aren't found. Mary and Jane waited day after day, clinging to the wild idea that maybe the men had been shipwrecked. Maybe they'd turn up on the doorstep, sunburned and hungry, kind of any moment now. Two women, one the wife, one the muse, bound together by loss and uncertainty, sitting in silence, listening for Well, news that never came. Eventually, the sea did give up its dead. Percy and Edward's bodies washed ashore. But even then, things weren't simple. Quarantine rules were in effect thanks to the outbreak of disease, and the authorities wouldn't allow the bodies to be brought inland. So they burned them right there on the beach. Mary couldn't bear it. She couldn't bring herself to watch. Byron and a handful of friends took on the dreadful task. And just when you think the story can't get any more gothic, there was one final, unbelievable twist. Because one part of Percy didn't burn, his heart. Yes, Percy Shelley's actual heart, unburnt and strangely preserved. It was the strangest thing. That part of his body just didn't burn. And Byron, in a gesture equal parts macabre and romantic, actually cut Percy's heart from the ashes and brought it back to Mary. Her husband's heart, slightly charred, bloodless, but still whole, and in many ways still hers. Mary kept it. She actually wrapped it very carefully in a silk scarf alongside some of Percy's poetry, and she kept it with her for the rest of her life. A relic of love, I suppose, that was as doomed as it was dazzling. Is it tragic? Yes. Is it romantic? Maybe in a deeply gothic way. Is it human? Absolutely. There's something heartbreakingly real about wanting to hold on to even the smallest piece of someone you loved after everything else is gone. But let's just take a breath. Step back just for a moment. How old is Mary Shelley at this point? She's just 24. 24 years old, and she's lived through more heartbreak, chaos, brilliance, and betrayal than most people will ever know in their entire life. She's lost parents, children, friends, lovers. She's been adored and abandoned, celebrated and scorned. So she goes back to England. There's nothing left for her in Italy. Not her children, not Percy, not a single reason to stay. And she doesn't go alone. She returns with Jane Williams, who had also just lost her partner that very day. And when you lose almost everything, it makes sense that you cling to whoever's left. Some people wonder if there was something more than friendship between Mary and Jane. Historians have asked this question for over 100 years. One thing you have to remember, women in the 19th century often wrote to each other in terms that sound extravagant to us. You know, you are the soul of my soul. But in this case, there are hints that Mary and Jane's bond may have actually been physical as well. And if it was, that would have been a criminal offense, one more secret, one more rebellion against the world's rules. But if anyone in that age was likely to follow her own heart, regardless of the law, it would have been Mary Shelley. She wasn't just progressive on paper, she was brave in her life. There's even a story about Mary helping two female friends elope to France together, risking her own reputation to give them a chance at happiness. She had spent her life among outsiders and radicals, and she always took the other side. And really, doesn't that make sense? This is a woman who created a monster, yes, but not a monster at all. A misunderstood creature, longing for love, cast out, feared, and unloved. If anyone knew what that felt like, it was Mary Shelley. Her fiction had always been about outsiders, about compassion and survival, about what happens to those who don't fit the mold. And all this, and she's still only just 24, about to turn 25, still so young and somehow with so much life left to go. So what does she do next? She does the only thing she's ever truly known. She writes. Because now Mary is a single mother, a widow, and of course, she needs to provide for her surviving son, Percy Florence Shelley. But life throws up another obstacle. Percy's father, Sir Timothy Shelley, wants nothing to do with her. He blames Mary for everything, for Percy's wildness, the scandal, the poetry, even his death. He's ashamed, and he wants custody of little Percy Florence. He wants to raise the boy himself, away from Mary's corrupting influence. So he offers her a bargain, if you can call it that. He'll pay a modest allowance, but only if Mary never publishes under her own name again. And this is where Mary has to make that incredibly painful choice. So she agrees. She gives up her public name to keep her child. She chooses motherhood over recognition. She sacrifices her own reputation so her son can stay with her. And I think that takes a different kind of courage, the quiet sort, the sort that gets overlooked in most history books. And Mary doesn't stop writing. She can't. She writes travel books, biographies, short stories, more novels, all the while shielding her son from the world that once tried to devour her. In her way, I think she preserves both her own voice and her son's future. Sir Timothy had wanted to raise his grandson as a proper Shelley, but Mary said, absolutely not. And so we cut her off. No inheritance, no allowance, no support. Just Mary and Percy Florence alone, broke, her trying to earn a living. But in writing for magazines, in writing the fiction, writing the biographies, anything that effectively would keep the household afloat, she preserved her own sanity. It's quite extraordinary, really. At a time when women really weren't expected and, more importantly, allowed to earn their own living. You know, Mary Shelley actually made it work, even with a reputation as a scandalous outsider, even as the daughter of radicals, even with society watching her, hoping for her to fail. So how did she manage? Well, she just got by. Not comfortably, but she survived. Mary and her son lived modestly, always keeping an eye on the clock, waiting, I suppose, for Sir Timothy to shuffle off this mortal coil and finally release the inheritance that they'd been denied for so long. And of course, eventually, inevitably, he did. At last, Percy Florence, now an adult, could care for his mother, which is actually quite touching, really, when you consider all that she'd given up for him. But there's a bit of a twist, isn't there always, in this story? Percy Florence, son of two of the 19th century's wildest and most visionary minds, turned out to be, quite possibly, the dullest man in the history of romanticism. He went to Eton like his dad. He went to Oxford like his dad. And he played a bit of rugby. He took up boating. He preferred golf to poetry. And frankly, found travel a bit of a nuisance. Not exactly a chip off the old block. But Mary, of course, adored him, and that was enough. His wife, Jane, was good to Mary. The two women became fast friends. But here's the sad part. Percy Florence and Jane, once they inherited, did what good Victorians did. They tidied everything up. They sanitized Mary's story. They scrubbed away the scandal and the politics, the gothic horror and the heartbreak. And in effect, they recast her as a respectable widow, the woman who once wrote a very spooky novel, but nothing more. And just like that, the real Mary, the rebel, the survivor, the genius, began to fade from view. Mary Shelley died in 1851, just 54 years old, taken by a brain tumor. Another one gone young. We've touched on this before. So how many of our greatest writers and artists barely made it out of their 40s or 50s? Maybe it was the times, or maybe it was the sheer weight that they carried. And you would have to argue that Mary certainly carried more than most. After she died, her daughter in law Jane did something extraordinary. She had Mary's parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, exhumed and buried in Bournemouth, where the Shelley family lived. And I think that's oddly kind of fitting. In a quiet family plot, Mary was finally laid to rest with her mother and her father. Later, her son, Percy Florence, added one more touch. He buried his father's heart, the very same preserved relic Byron had once handed to Mary with her. So, in the end, a family reunited in death, a story that began with such fire, such passion and fever, ending in the quiet earth. A wild, if you like, almost mythic journey, closed by a very gentle act of remembrance. And after all my reading and research on Mary Shelley, here's my honest take. Yes, Frankenstein absolutely changed everything. But there's another book of hers I think that deserves so much more attention, and it's called The Last Man. And if you haven't read it, you must. The Last Man might just be the world's first real apocalypse novel. It was written in 1826, long before The Road, long before The Stand, long before dystopia and the end of the world became the stuff of literary fashion. And it asks, what happens if humanity is wiped out? What if one person is left to watch it all fade? And of course, you can see exactly where that question came from. You know, Mary wrote The Last Man after almost everyone she loved was gone. Shelley, Byron, her children, her sister. It's not just a story about the end of the world. It's about what it means to survive loss so total, so immense, it feels like the world itself has ended. In that way, Mary didn't just invent science fiction. She may have given us the first modern novel of grief. So here's to Mary, the orphan, the radical, the lover, the widow, the mother, the author, the survivor. In effect, the last woman standing. She began writing The Last Man just after she heard about Lord Byron's death, and it hit her harder than she expected. He was the last living link to that wild, youthful circle on Lake Geneva. She was then 28, and everyone was gone. It's actually very hard to imagine, isn't it? Being the final witness to your own vanished generation. And I think in classic Mary fashion, she didn't just brood on that feeling. She wrote it, she transformed it. The Last Man is deeply autobiographical, almost a coded memoir. The narrator, Lionel Verney, is the ultimate outsider, wandering through the ruins of a world wiped out by the plague. And he's joined by two giants, a saintly, visionary nobleman named Adrian, clearly modeled after Percy Shelley, and a dashing, magnetic, sometimes reckless Lord Raymond, undeniably Byron. You know, Mary was writing her lost loved ones back into existence, if only for a few hundred pages. And then, of course, catastrophe hits. A plague sweeps across the world. The plague in The Last Man sweeps through the hotter countries first, then rolls across Europe like a black tide. You know, England is soon flooded with desperate refugees, chaos, collapse, the whole fabric of society torn to shreds. Adrian, Mary's stand-in for Percy Shelley, rises to the moment, noble, compassionate, heroic. But in the end, spoiler alert, everyone dies, all of them. Only Lionel Verney is left, wandering a ruined world utterly alone. And I have to say, this novel floored me for two very good reasons. Firstly, it's set at the end of the 21st century. Just think about that for a second. Mary Shelley, writing in the 1820s, was imagining our future. Her world is actually one of pandemic, climate chaos, mass migration, environmental disaster. 300 years ago, she was warning us about the very problems that we're wrestling with today. So, to any climate deniers out there, maybe it's time to listen to Mary Shelley. Secondly, The Last Man is a total break from the big romantic idea that imagination can always save us. You know, the romantics thought poetry and creativity could redeem any pain. But Mary's novel says, nope, try dreaming your way out of this. There's no magic solution, no grand escape, just loss, loneliness, and the very difficult business of surviving. It's a genre defying, bleak, bold, visionary book written decades before H.G. Wells or Jules Verne ever imagined time machines or moon rockets. And in it, Mary Shelley once again redefined what literature could be. She broke every rule and she made something absolutely brand spanking new. Honestly, well done, Mary. You beautiful, prophetic, world changing genius. And you have to love her for it. And really, that's the thread running through all her work. If we mistreat outsiders, if we abuse the world around us, if we act without empathy, sooner or later it comes back around. Mary Shelley didn't just invent science fiction, she gave it a conscience. She wrote the rule. Actions have consequences, and empathy is the only way forward. So, yes, what a life. So much tragedy, so much loss, but also such astonishing resilience, such fierce courage, and such a jaw-dropping legacy. Guys, thanks for listening in to the Mary Shelley story. For me, her life is it's like a literary game of Cluedo, played out in the candlelight of Europe, full of dramatic exits and shocking twists and characters like Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, and Polidori, wandering from storm to scandal. But I think what I'll never forget and what I'd like to leave you with is her strength. In the face of grief, scandal, and every loss you could imagine, she kept going. Quietly, unstoppably, she kept writing, she kept creating. And I think that's why she's one of my favorite authors. And maybe, just maybe, she'll be one of yours too. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.